Welcome back to my series of readings on Twisted Confessions by Bryan Bloom. So I'm going to start or continue, I should say, with chapter 4, probably get through a few chapters, and I'll either comment in the middle to try to bridge between the fictional and the non-fictional world, or I'll do it at the end. Monday, 6:30 p.m. Detective Chris Whittier was steadfast when it came to following procedures, whether it was the rigid edge he gained from his time in the Marine Corps or his desire to live life in a way that was opposite of how he was raised. The man was a stickler for rules and created his own rituals along the way. One of those rituals was scoping out his interviewees before they entered the interview room. It gave him an opportunity to pick up on any habits or details that would otherwise be hidden once the potential suspect sat opposite him on the receiving end of his questions. He should be tired after a day of interviewing potential suspects and witnesses, but his heightened adrenaline had his blood surging through his body, naturally upping his energy levels. Next up was the accounting dean from Lincoln State University, Stephen Eilson. From what he could gather, the man was nervous, with an uncontrollable foot tapping on the laminate floor of the station's waiting room. He knew this because he had made it a point to chat with the volunteer officer manning the reception area. Even from behind the glass barrier, Chris picked up on the nerves that were swirling like a tornado around the middle-aged man's body. As if on repeat, he swiped through his phone, slid it into the front pocket of his messenger bag, bent over, and retrieved the phone again, cycling through the same routine. Swipe, pocket, bend over, swipe, pocket, bend over. And all of this while he was simultaneously tapped his foot. If he didn't know better, he'd assume the man was engaging in some type of routine performance. The last several interviewees didn't emit such nerves, which either meant that they were better performers or they were innocent. Ross Jackson seemed genuinely somber, as did the handful of students he interviewed, except for Aaron Siebowitz. There was something off about him, but he did appear confident when he admitted to being with Jane in her office on Friday afternoon. When questioned about why he met with her, he shared that he had some new financial material to present to her with and ideas for the curriculum. A little aggressive for a student, but according to the other students Chris interviewed, that was simply how Sibo rolled. He evidently had a reputation of being someone who boldly stood up for what they believed in, and it gave him mixed reviews from the student body. Unlike the half asleep eyes and slow movements of Ross Jackson, Sibo was on high alert and as if he could detonate at any point. Mr. Eilson, Detective Whittier stood up against the door that joined the main hall with the reception area. In step two of his routine, he slipped the phone into the pocket of his bag and looked up for the first time, long after the door had opened with a loud click. His gaze darted side to side, as if he was waiting for someone else to enter the room. Yes? Chris offered his best pair of raised eyebrows. After you. As another one of his pre-interview rituals, Chris waved a hand in front of him, letting the interviewee go first so he could assess his gait. Second door on the left. Please call me Stephen. He picked up on the forward curve of Stephen's shoulders, how the C in his posture made him look shorter than he was. His steps were slower than average, another sign that he was trying to appear calm, concealing any signs of guilt. The average person moves at a faster clip, fueled partly by the fact that they are in a police station and are about to be on the receiving end of a series of questions. There was something that wasn't average about Steve Eilson, and the chill that ran up Chris's spine when they were both sitting across from one another in a closed room was added proof. So, you had a close working relationship with Dean Lawrence. Chris dove right in. Yes, Steve responded more to the table than to Chris, with his eyes set on the flat metal surface. Chris felt a sliver of guilt at the satisfaction he felt, knowing someone was feeling uncomfortable in his presence. He was one step closer to finding the monster who murdered the dean. How long did you two work together? Chris watched as, in one fluid motion, Stephen's head lifted. His eyes clicked into place on Chris's own eyes, and he rattled off his next words in rapid succession. Since she had only been there for 2 years, I've worked with her for 2 years. And what was your working relationship like? Stephen's gaze stayed locked into place as he continued. It was fine. We collaborated at times when we had interdepartmental functions. I imagine the dean of accounting and the dean of finance would have some crossover. Yes, Chris had seen this type of suspect before, the type that was trying his best to appear calm, maintain eye contact, even though he was rippling with nerves on the inside. He would see the outline of sweat on the table where his palms were flattened in front of him. His words came out with little inflection, but they came out nonetheless. That was typically the goal of the guilty, to talk in a tone that didn't waver, to transfer the practiced words from mind to mouth. When was the last time you saw Jane? Yesterday. On a Sunday? No, I meant Friday. Sorry, I forgot about the weekend. Chris didn't have to be a detective to know that this guy was starting to trip on his words. Stephen's mistake in his timeline was starting to cause a mustache of sweat on his upper lip. The air in the interview room was colder than normal. It was the second week in November. The temperatures were in the low 50s, and the higher ups still didn't allow the heat to be turned on until later in the month. So Chris was certain that the room was not warm. This is what Chris had nicknamed flustered perspiration. This guy was starting to squirm, and now is the perfect opportunity to push a couple of buttons. So you say you didn't see Jane over the weekend? Yes, I saw her Friday at school. Was that the last time I saw her? That was the last time I saw her. Chris's next step was to take a risk, a follow-up to his gut feeling. He opened the folder in front of him. It looks like our tech team uncovered a camera on Jane's property. He pretended to read the next words on the blank sheet of paper in front of him. Yeah, that's it. Slater Safety installed a camera above the entryway on June 30th. Wait a minute. Stephen squinted his eyes together, likely searching for a new answer. I got him. Now that I think about it, I did stop by Jane's to drop something off on Saturday. Hook. So, did you go over to her place of residence on Saturday? And what were you dropping off? Flowers. The word came out like a bullet, fast and loud, determined to shoot its way into the air. Line. Flowers? Why would you bring Jane's flowers? It was my wife's idea. Your wife suggested that you bring another woman flowers. It's not like that. So Dina, my wife, and Jane are friends, and recently Jane had a minor procedure, and she wanted me to drop some flowers by on my way home from the office. So you also went to the office on Saturday. Yes, I had to stop by to pick up some paperwork. Okay, so after you picked up some paperwork, you purchased some flowers from there. The Twisted Vine on Main Street. Okay, so if I go to the Twisted Vine, do you think they'll corroborate your story? Stephen's gaze darted back and forth before it landed on Chris. Wait, what do you mean corroborate? Why does my story need to be corroborated? His pale brown eyes linked in a display of concern. He was getting more nervous. Sinker. It's just due diligence. We're doing it with all the suspects. Chris threw another risk onto the table in hope of the response he was looking for. Suspects? Are you saying I'm a suspect? Stephen hissed as he leaned forward. No, no, not yet at least. What the heck? Jane Lawrence was one of my friends. How dare you accuse me of murdering her? Mr. Ileson, no one is accusing you of murder. We're simply crossing our T's and dotting our I's. Right now, until we have more information, everyone is a suspect. I use that term loosely. Stephen leaned back in his chair. Do I need to get an attorney? Just tell me right now if I need to get my my lawyer down here. Mr. Ileson calmed down. Chris threw another grenade out there. In most cases, guilty parties despise being told to calm down. The little psychology that Chris had picked up on was that guilty people didn't want to appear guilty. So being told to calm down made it seem as if they were acting out and on edge. Don't tell me to calm down. You brought me in here after the death of my friend, and you're asking me to be calm through all of this. He angled in again and lowered his voice to a whisper. You need to do your job and find out who really did this. Chris leaned back in his chair and took a moment to study Stephen's face, committing it to memory. He picked up on what was certain was worry etched in the creases of Stephen's forehead, in the lines that reached out from the edge of his eyes, and from the somber expression he held on his face. It wasn't that far off from the same worry that he saw portrayed on Siebo's face during the interview. There seemed to be a common theme in these two men, an underlying passion that Chris couldn't quite put his finger on. Chapter 5, Tuesday, November 8th, 2022, 8:30 a.m. The Lincoln State University auditorium across the street from Dean James Lawrence's office, just far enough away from the crime scene to be permitted. Ross walked across the parking lot toward the gray and white building. A swirl of colorful leaves lifted off the ground by his feet and circled in the air before it landed, and each leaf went its separate way. Fall was in full swing, and the eerie wind and earlier nightfall made a fitting backdrop for the aftermath of the dean's murder. Adding to this somber atmosphere was the fact that the winter was right around the corner, when many people would succumb to depression caused by the lack of sunlight, seasonal affective disorder, or SAD, as Ross remembered Samantha referring to it. She was a victim of the disorder herself and had made a hefty purchase on a light that promised to treat her somber winter mood. The object sat in their office, its neck craning forward, a large rectangular lamp at the ready for Samantha's daily sessions of light therapy. Although Jane's body was only discovered yesterday, the police investigation was well underway, and the forensics team continued to gather material from her office. So far, from what Ross had determined, the takeout container and a few odd documents sat front and center on the list of clues. Allegedly, the delivery person was the last to see Jane before she was murdered, unless, of course, the delivery person was actually the guilty party. Moving up the steps through the melancholic air, Ross always kept a watchful eye around his perimeter. Just a few days ago, he and Samantha were chatting about how grateful they were to have raised their girls in such a safe town, with all the necessities and none of the crime that the big cities had. And now, one of his closest friends was murdered for what seemed to be no apparent reason, and he was in a constant state of fear, even when he was on the premises of his most frequented space, Lincoln State University. As he pulled the door of the auditorium open, a paper that was hastily taped to the glass panel flipped up and hit him in the chin. He let the door settle into a closed position again so he could take in the bold pink and blue cursive font on the sheet. Please join us for a candlelight vigil for Dean Jane Lawrence, November 11th at 8 p.m. in front of Wesley Hall. Beneath the writing was an expanded version of Jane's faculty photo. Ross pulled the paper off the door and stuck it in his friend's face. The green green eyes that were filled with kindness, the smile that exuded warmth. All her memorable features shined through the grainy and large print as if they were begging to be seen. What happened to you, Jane? Ross silently directed the question to the paper when he heard footsteps approaching behind him. Ross, a man he recognized as Dwyer Edmonton from the English department, opened the door next to him. Much in the same way high school students broke up into cliques based on their interests, the faculty on a college campus tended to cluster together based on their professions. The art and the English departments in particular held strong to staying with their own, sharing the common bond of creativity. Ross had only engaged with Dwyer at interdepartmental meetings, which was why they were standing side by side at the moment. Hi, Dwyer. Ross was caught off guard, holding the flyer in his hand. With sweaty palms, he pressed it back on the glass, holding it tight so it would stick. Ever since he was interviewed by Detective Whittier, he'd been on edge. And even though it sounded ridiculous in his own head, he worried that Dwyer would think he was either suspicious or slightly obsessed with Jane if he saw the flyer in his hand. This fell off the door. Doesn't seem to be sticking. He gave it one last firm hold and pulled the door open, walking side by side with Dwyer. So, how are you doing? Dwyer asked, adjusting his brown leather messenger bag on his shoulder. The man fit the mold as English professor, with his shoulder-length brown hair that pushed back off his forehead, flecks of gray earning him a level of maturity and authority amongst the student body. Black rimmed glasses and a touch of stubble on his chin added to the look of wisdom that he exuded. He regularly appeared windblown as if he had just gotten off a motorcycle and landed on the college campus, always ready to rattle off a moving quote by the literary legends. Staying true to his identity, he wore a brown jacket with gray elbow patches, and it often appeared as if he was in deep thought. To what? Ross turned toward Dwyer, confused. The vigil. Are you going to the vigil? Oh, yeah. I'm sorry. Yeah, I'll be there. How are you holding up? I imagine it's not easy having one of your closest colleagues die so young, and now you have to attend meetings like this. Dwyer was referring to the faculty meeting where they were both headed. The chancellor of the college arranged the gathering, wanting to go over any updates regarding the murder and, of course, to discuss where they would conduct classes with the finance building still a crime scene. Professors would have to shift and share rooms with faculty from other departments momentarily, but the show would go on. Meanwhile, Jane was gone. Ross would never be able to go to her for advice regarding a student. They'd never meet for lunch and chat about the latest and greatest in the high school finance program they were both passionate about. Ross was certain no one would be engaging with the high school students as Jane was. Yeah, it hasn't been easy. Ross had no issues with Dwyer Edmonton, but he found himself putting a stop to words before they surfaced. He couldn't trust anyone right now, at least not until they found out who murdered his friend. It just doesn't make sense. What happened to her? Dwyer didn't respond, at least not right away. He waited until they reached the door of the auditorium where faculty members were trickling through, as if it was just another day, another meeting to attend. He turned toward Ross, embraced his elbow in a friendly gesture, and said, the truth will set you free. After the words left Dwyer's lips, he trotted down the corridor that divided the many seats circling the stage. Ross stood there dumbfounded, as if someone had just spoken another language to him. By the time he reached an empty seat, he had already constructed a dozen different scenarios surrounding the quote that Dwyer threw at him. Why would he say something so vague? The guy was known for throwing random quotes around, but it was usually related to Shakespeare or the literary greats. It sounded to him like Dwyer Edmonton was a little too knowledgeable about the truth. He silently scolded himself for jumping to conclusions, but at this point, he couldn't trust anyone. Looking around the auditorium, He took in the faces of his colleagues, a blend of the expressions that would haunt him later. Isla Jacobi, longtime economics professor, wiped at a single tear as she read a vigil flyer. Innocent. Michael Moore and Jeff Clark were seated side by side to the left of him. They seemed to be in deep conversation as they engaged in serious whispers and darting eyes. Possibly guilty. A cluster of faculty from the art department was sat several rows in front of Ross, hardly engaging with one another. They sat with heads straight and eyes on the stage, unmoving. He couldn't imagine what issues an art professor would have had with Jane. That department kept to themselves and likely never had any associations with the finance department. Innocent. Ross twisted his neck so it was in line with the left section of the auditorium, where the rows narrowed down to 10 seats instead of the much longer rows in the middle. Many of the women had somber, confused expressions, the news of the murder still so fresh in their minds. Most of the men made themselves look busy, swiping through their phones or flipping through books and binders. It was like the first week of school all over again, except with an eerie edge. Any noise that was present came to a halt as soon as Chancellor Alfred Bates approached the stage. He walked to the podium with a slow gait and slouched shoulders. The man looked as if he had aged a decade since the murder. Just 2 weeks ago, he and Jane had met with him to get their high school program approved. He had been just as excited as they had, signing off on an extra allotment of funds to be dedicated specifically to the program. He was a good chancellor, deeply passionate about education and open-minded when the staff and faculty came to him with innovative ideas. Now, those 2 weeks felt like a lifetime ago, and Alfred had the physical disposition to prove it. His skin, already weathered from the summer weeks that he spent fishing in Florida, was absent of the healthy tan and replaced with patchy red spots. Baggy pillows hung beneath his eyes. He swiped his salt and pepper hair across his head, concealing a portion of his bald spot, before he spoke into the microphone in a shaky voice. Thank you for coming. He let out a cough that seemed to stem from a blend of nerves and congestion. I know this isn't easy for any of us. When I woke up yesterday morning, never in a million years did I expect to receive the news I did, that we all did. He shook his head side to side, defeated. This isn't the time or the place to go on about how wonderful Dean Jane Lawrence was, but I feel compelled to tell you that she was a star professor, and I feel incredibly protective of her death, incredibly protective of this campus. He scanned the audience as if he was looking for the killer himself. Whoever did this will be caught. I can promise you that. And that's all I'm going to say about it right now. He held steady in his stance, a powerful gaze set on his face as he shifted topics. I hope all, or many of you, can join us for the vigil on Friday night. He sniffed and wiped at the corner of his eyes, pushed his shoulders back, and continued. But that's not what we're here to talk about. We're here to discuss how we're going to move on during this time. Not away from Jane, but move on with educating students. As you'll see in the document I emailed you, we'll have to switch up some classroom locations, doubling up on some and getting creative with others. Because of the police work to solve this tragic case, a portion of our campus is considered a crime scene, as I'm sure you've already noticed. The campus will still be closed for this week as police comb through the rest of the buildings, but we hope to open next week after they deem the other buildings as clear. Until then, consider this your time to grieve. Spend time with your families. Hug those who you are close to, because as we've learned over the past couple of days, you'd never know when someone is going to be gone from your life for good. Alfred scanned the audience and again, with his gaze, landed on Ross. It sent a chill up his spine. Why did he stop on me? Did he think I had something to do with the murder? Even though the auditorium was its normal frigid temperature, He could feel a circle of sweat forming under his arms. He had nothing to be nervous about, yet here he was, with a rapidly beating heart and an inability to hold the man's eye contact. He knew his brain was playing tricks on him, and he had no reason to feel guilty, but there was something niggling in the back of his mind, an undertone that said otherwise. Was there something that he did or didn't do that led to Jane Lawrence being murdered? Chapter 6, Tuesday, 9 a.m. Detective Chris Whittier dropped his head, allowing his sunglasses to fall into place. He leaned back on his car door, shutting it closed as he angled his head towards the sliver of sun that was peeking through the autumn leaves. The air was unusually warm for a November morning, with the exception of a few flyers showcasing Friday night's vigil. The town of Twisted Straits seemed normal. The regulars were frequenting frequenting their favorite spots on Main Street, and the local businesses were opening up at a snail's pace. Chris looked at his watch. It was 9 o'clock on the dot, and several of the shop signs were still flipped to closed. Everything opened so late in this town, except, of course, for the local coffee shop that was buzzing like a nightclub in New York City. Straight Brew was 3 doors down from the Twisted Vine. The classic territorial names were a perfect draw for the many tourists who frequented the downtown, thanks to the university's locale. The open side of the sign had yet to turn at the flower shop, so Chris decided to kill some time in the coffee shop. Leaves crunched beneath his feet as he approached the door, passing by a party of four seated at an outside table. College students taking advantage of their empty mornings due to the university being closed for the week. He wondered what these kids thought about their dean being murdered. Surely he'd be interviewing more students than the handful he had already had, and he'd get to know the inner workings of a college kid's mind. What went through their moldable brains when they received the news that a faculty member on their campus was murdered? Aaron Siebowitz, the kid they called Sibo, stood out among the others. The interview had been strange. It was as if the kid was filling the helium every time he was asked a question. From what he gathered, the kid was smart, maybe too smart for his own good. Every time Chris inquired about something, Sibo's face would fill with what looked to be answers, but they'd never surface. Instead, he acted as if he didn't know a thing about the death of the professor he had met with just 3 days before she was murdered. According to Sibo, he met up with Jane Lawrence in her office to discuss a grade. That was on a Friday, and her body was discovered slain just 2 days later, a knife plunged into a carotid artery. The only valid piece of evidence on the scene so far was a clump of red hair belonging to Jane spread out on the floor in front of her. This told Detective Whittier that whoever killed her approached her from the front and used one hand to pull her hair back while they went to the work on restricting the blood to her brain. The way Jane's body was discovered, face up in a pool of blood, told him that the killer was stronger and taller than her, someone who could assert themselves over a 5'10" frame. Chris had seen a lot in his lifetime, thanks to his time spent as a military police officer with the Marine Corps. He may not have seen much since he'd been working at the Twisted Straits Police Department, but his life prior more than made up for it. He had seen enough to know that Sibo had more of a story to tell, but for whatever reason, he was keeping quiet. Much in the same way he used to get bored while assigned to the gate at Camp Pendleton before being sent to Iraq. He knew that this was the calm before the storm, and he was about to step into a war zone. Hi, Detective Whittier. A scratchy voice came from an outdoor table, broke into his thoughts. He turned to see Barbara Bishop, town gossip. Oh, hi, Miss Bishop. How are you? She swirled her tea bag in her cup, pinching the tag with two knobby fingers. Better than you, I'm sure. Are you up to your ears with work with all this murder business going on? Her lip curled up on the side into a slight smile, as if she found joy at the thought of something to gossip about. Chris stopped himself from scolding her, educating her on empathy and showing some respect for the dead. The woman was a monster. She was always sticking her nose where it didn't belong, concocting ideas and judgments about everyone in town. 9 out of 10 times there was little truth to her suggestions, and her gossip was muddled with lies. Yeah, you could say that. Chris pressed his lips tightly together, trying his hardest not to respond the way he really wanted to. Can I let you in on a little secret? Just as Chris was about to open the door and pretend he didn't hear her question, she continued. I saw Jane Lawrence not too long before she was murdered. Chris could hear the college kids at the nearby table get quiet, their stares penetrating the back of his head. He shouldn't be surprised that Barbara Bishop was speaking so loudly about a sensitive topic. After all, this was her MO. But he felt compelled to listen to what she had to say. If anything, it would stop her from saying more. He let the door close and walked to her table. Do you mind? He motioned to the chair opposite. By all means. Her facial features settled into a warm welcome. She had Chris exactly where she wanted him, on the receiving end of her tiny little fabrications. Now, what is this you were saying? Chris dropped into the chair. Well, Detective Whittier, I don't normally share this kind of gossip with others, as I don't believe it's kind to pass judgment. But I saw something the other day that I think may be of interest to you and your case. Yeah, right. You're the town gossip, he thought to himself. And what would that be, Miss Bishop? He maintained eye contact, acting interested, even though he wanted to remove himself from the situation as fast as possible. Well, I saw Jane Lawrence with a man. Chris heard a false crescendo of fireworks go off in his head. This woman loved a climatic event, and she evidently thought that woman seen with a man was illegal. It was similar to the time she called dispatch to alert the department that a woman was seen pushing an empty stroller. She immediately accused the poor mother of being a negligent parent, forgetting her child at home. It turned out that the mother had dropped the baby off at a nearby daycare and was simply walking back with the stroller. Really? And who was the man? She leaned forward with bulging grasshopper like eyes. That's just it. She paused and looked around before settling her gaze on his. I'd never seen him before. He definitely wasn't from around here. More illegal activity. So, are you saying you saw Jane, a single woman, wandering around town with a man that wasn't from Twisted Straits? Chris tried his hardest not to sound sarcastic, but the false excitement in his voice could no doubt be detected by the people. But then again, Barbara Bishop wasn't most people. Oh, they weren't wandering. They knew exactly where they were going. How so? Detective Whittier, I've been around the block, and I know when something is going on. With that, Chris pushed himself up from the table. Thanks, Miss Bishop. I'll keep you, I'll keep what you said in mind. You couldn't take any more of a woman's nonsense. He couldn't take any more of a woman's nonsense. Whatever you say, detective. As he turned to walk away, he tugged back by her scratchy voice. Detective, don't you want to know what the man looked like? He was at his wits' end with the woman, but he took the high road and humored her. What did he look like, Miss Bishop? He was tall, really tall, like a giant. Hard to miss. She held her hand up high, showcasing the enormity of his height. Dark hair in one of those styles the youngsters are wearing these days. You know, that moppy look today's youth wear. Chris had no idea what the woman was referring to, but if he was being honest with himself, he didn't care. He looked young, younger than Jane. Maybe she was robbing the cradle, or maybe dating a student. The questions continued to rattle out of her mouth like a money machine spitting out change, and that was Chris's cue to leave. He walked into the coffee shop, ordered a latte, and walked along the storefronts until he reached the Twisted Vine. The one good thing about bumping into Barbara Bishop was it helped the time to go by a little faster, and the flower shop sign was flipped to open. The smell of flowers penetrated Chris's nostrils as he walked through the store. The staff was still setting up display items, so he made himself busy assessing the bouquets that lined the shelves. Varying heights and colors of flowers and greenery, succulents and plants. He gave the staff the time to go about their business. His experience in police work taught him that people were more likely to remember things if they weren't stressed out. A girl with long blonde hair pulled back in a ponytail peeked her head behind a bouquet he was admiring. Hi, can I help you? Oh, hi. Chris backed up, startled by the way the woman emerged from the greenery. Yes, I'm Detective Whittier. I have a few questions for the manager. Whenever she or he is ready, no rush. He dug out the badge that was pinned to the inner pocket of his jacket and flashed in front of her for confirmation. Well, I thought I'd be giving you advice on what color roses to purchase, but police questioning it is. Girl released a wide, friendly smile, revealing a dimple in each cheek. Follow me. We can sit in my quasi office back here. Izzy, I'll be out back tending to some business. Can you handle the front? Yep. The girl at the register didn't look up as she clipped a few straggly leaves from a bouquet. Are you the manager? That's me. The girl turned and held out a hand. Claire Donahue. I inherited the shop from my grandmother, but I've been helping her in this store from the time I could walk. I'm sure she would be proud of you, Chris said, as he made a show of admiring the store, taking in all the colors and nature around him. Take a seat, Mr. Sergeant Detective, but you can call me Chris. He was used to civilians forgetting his rank, even after he had just announced it. Sometimes all people saw was a uniform or a badge, and everything else clouded over. Got it right on the third try, Claire winked. Chris found himself smiling. Claire Donahue was easy to talk to. In a field where most people tried to avoid you, he welcomed this type of one-on-one conversation. He took out his notepad and started to lean on the table, but thought otherwise when it started to wobble. Sorry, old furniture, Claire said as she leaned down and adjusted a piece of cardboard under one of the table legs. It's time to upgrade, but I guess I don't have it in me to get rid of Graham's stuff. She took a sip of her tea and leaned back as a loose blonde tendril escaped her ponytail and landed alongside her temple. Anyways, you're here to ask me some questions. Yes, so I want to make sure the truth matches up with the story that one of my interviewees told me. Since Chris had spoken to Stephen, he had verified that Jane did, in fact, undergo a very minor procedure, and a local dermatologist confirmed that he had removed a questionable patch of skin on Jane's back. The next step, making sure those flowers were really purchased by Stephen. So I just have a couple questions about a customer who claims he was here on Saturday. You might need to look up a receipt or something. I'm sure you don't remember every customer that walks through the door. You'd be surprised. Try me. She passed him a crooked smile, revealing one of her two dimples that gave her a natural baby face. Do you remember Stephen Eilson coming in here on Saturday? Stevie? Of course. And I remember that specifically because he joked about his future daughter working here someday. His wife is about to give birth to a baby girl like any day now. Do you happen to remember what kind of flowers he bought? Yes, pink and purple daisies with a get well card. Not sure who they were for, but they were more summery than I would suggest for this time of year. If you're trying to accuse him of a murder, I'd say the only one he committed was the fact that he chose a very unfitting flower. No crime accusations here. Just wanted to corroborate the story. Do you know Stephen well? as well as I know everyone else in this town. I mean, my grandmother worked with his mother, and so on and so on. If you haven't noticed already, Twisted Straits is made up of generations of families that go way back. You literally aren't considered a townie unless you were born here, no matter how long you've lived here. She leaned in towards Chris. It really makes me think twice before I go on dates with the locals. You never know when you're going to realize you're in love with your second cousin twice removed or something. She winked at Chris, and she found himself and he found himself taken aback by the wave of relief he felt when he learned she was single. I get it. Chris tapped the notepad with the pen. The tapping served as a nervous reaction. I've lived in my fair share of small towns too. Ah, but did you just pass through, or were you a fifth generation family member to live there? Only passed through, so I guess that would make me free to date all the locals. Chris started to wink back at her, but stopped himself when he realized it probably wasn't a flirtatious gesture. Claire Donahue probably winked at everyone. She was that type of friendly girl. Well, in that case, you would be considered fresh meat by the locals. Claire tucked the loose strand of her hair through her ear. Accidentally dating cousins is really my own fault, though. I could have moved away a long time ago. Spread my wings, move on, check off all those bucket list items. She leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms over her chest as she looked off into space, her big doe eyes making her look like a teenager caught in a daydream. Well, then where would people go for flowers if you weren't here to run the Twisted Vine? Oh, I'm sure my dad would have hired someone to take over the store. He has quite the attachment to it. After all the work he had to do to help my grandmother pay for it when my grandfather died, well, there's no way he would have let this little shop go to waste. Sounds like he'd do anything to keep his mom's store alive. You've got that right. Claire passed a closed lip smile and held her gaze onto his for an uncomfortably long time. Chris felt a little bit like a junior high school student at a first dance. I do appreciate your time, Claire. He stood up from the table. The parlor chair hit the pale green wall in line with the scuff mark that was already there. A place this old had dents and bruises that were part of the decor. Any time. I'll walk you out, detective. Claire led him to the door, brushing her fingertips on the vines and petals that reached into the small aisle. Chris saw her passion for plants in the gentle way she caressed them, as if they were additional limbs stemming from her body. It was similar to the way he felt about law enforcement. Being a detective had its downsides. The unruly town residents in the barely there social life of a cop, but he loved the job, much in the same way that Claire Donahue loved her plants and keeping her grandmother's and father's dream alive. If you need anything else, don't hesitate to call. She dug in a deep pocket, her loose fitting cotton pants pinched together at the top by a feminine tool belt that held a variety of different sized clippers. Sorry, my entire world is in this tool belt. She made a show of digging around in the belt and retrieved a simple white business card with black print. Thanks, and if you need to find me for, I don't know, any hostile customers, you know where to find me. Claire held two fingers to her brow and saluted to Chris as he reached to the door. Just as his hands hit the cold metal of the handle, a reminder burst into his mind. Actually, he turned to face her. I need a bouquet for someone. I might as well order them while I'm here. Oh, well, you're at the right place. Claire twisted her neck back toward the register and contorted her mouth into a partial frown when she saw a grumpy man hunched over a cane, mumbling something about the tiny potted cactus that was nesting in the palm of his free hand. I'll have to help Mr. Adams, but Izzy over there will be happy to assist you. She swaggered back down the aisle, mentioning to figure that Chris couldn't see. Izzy, this gentleman needs help picking out a bouquet. You know the drill. Sure thing. The girl's soft voice spilled into the aisle from behind a massive potted plant, and the movement of the leaves gave way to a brown bun messily piled on her head. She greeted him with the same doe-eyed expression that Claire did. The only difference was the heavy eyeliner that circled the two blue globes that sat between dark arched eyebrows, and a button nose. Yes, I am. Chris stared at her blankly. I'm sorry, you're what? I'm Claire's younger sister. Yeah, half, but yeah, we share the DNA that makes us look so much alike. Oh, I didn't know. I know, but you would have asked once you started looking to me, started talking to me. Sorry, let me say that again. I know, but you would have asked me once you started talking to me. You would have picked up on the nearly identical hand gestures, the marked facial expressions that mirror one another. And if you really look closely, you have the same freckle on our we have the same freckle on the right temple. The girl held an orange painted fingernail up to her brow, and in that moment, Chris was dumbfounded by how much they really did look alike. He turned his head back to the cash register where Claire was animatedly talking to the alleged Mr. Adams in a voice that sounded like an echo of Izzy's voice. The only difference was the hair color, and as if reading his mind, Izzy continued. At first glance, our hair is the only difference. But once you get to know us, we couldn't be more opposite. She adjusted the tool belt on her waist and passed a crooked smile to Chris. So, enough about me. What can I do for you? So, I take it you two share a grandmother. Yeah, Grandma Dorothy owned this shop for years. Did you know this is actually one of the most long-standing businesses in Twisted Straits? The girl started walking down a path of plants broke off the main aisle. Claire got Grandma's green thumb. I'm just here to help. A little sister sidekick. And with that, I'll lead you to our most basic bouquets and ask you the assigned questions we've been asking for years. She stopped in front of a shelf that had a variety of vases, a deep orange glass globe showcasing a mound of black and yellow flowers, animal shaped vases sprouting pink petals, and baskets of yellow and orange mums. Question number one, what's the occasion? Well, it's actually for a somber occasion, so nothing too cheerful, I suppose. Ah, that seems to be our go-to selection these days. Izzy raised her eyebrows knowingly. Everyone was buying flowers for the murdered dean. Chris, however, was buying them to blend in. He had intentions of showing up at the candlelight vigil Friday evening, hopefully camouflaged as a mourner. A hat, scarf, gloves, and a bouquet of flowers might do the trick. Something simple. He couldn't take a chance standing out with an extravagant bouquet. Well, with that said, I don't need to ask you the next two questions. Glad I could make your job easier, Chris smiled. This is a classic, black-eyed Susans. Izzy used a couple of fingers to flick back the petals on a bouquet of black-eyed Susans held up upright by a tall, thin glass vase dotted with orange and black spots. Would you prefer a vase or just a simple bouquet? I can spice it up with some purple fountain grass. That sounds perfect. No vase necessary. A bouquet will be fine. Card? Chris paused. He hadn't thought about adding a card. No, that's okay. Anonymous is fine. Izzy wrinkled her defined eyebrows together and tilted her head. Sounds so undercover. Well, part of the job, I suppose. Izzy pulled a notepad out of her tool belt and started writing something down. Job? Chris assumed that everyone knew he was a detective. It had been a year since he had been promoted to the role, but he still hadn't gotten used to not wearing a uniform every day. He often forgot he was in civilian clothes and people didn't attach him to the job. It was the it was only the old folks that seemed to recognize him. Detective? Izzy's pen came to an abrupt halt. Her blue eyes led the rest of her face upwards before she paused, assessing Chris from head to toe. Are you covering the LSU murder? Yep. Oh, the word dropped from her lips as quickly as she changed the subject. So when do you want to pick up your bouquet? I can have it ready this afternoon unless you want to wait until Friday afternoon is fine. Chris felt the emotion wafting off the girl. She had something to say or not, and he was determined to find out what the reaction to his job was stemming from. So do you work here part-time? Yep, just during the days. She kept her eyes trained on the notepad where she was writing more notes frantically. Do you work anywhere else? Nope, just here during the day and school at night. I'm one of those rare older students at LSU. Chris laughed. Is this the part of your personality that is different than your sister's? No, I'm just really busy at school and theater that I don't have a lot of time to help her. That's all. Theater? It's my major. Aspiring actress, singer, aspiring actress, singer. I kind of hit 30 and realized that if I didn't go after my dreams now, I'll be 40 and trying to go after them then. Chris didn't show his upset over the fact that he was over 40 and feeling every bit that much older than Izzy. Well, I think that's wonderful. This town needs more artists. Lord knows I've tried to be one. Chris thought about his own artistic side. He had dabbled in painting, a suggestion recommended by the therapist he saw after he got back from Iraq. Much to his chagrin, painting helped his PTSD, and it served as an outlet that he still utilized every now and then. You don't strike me as the artsy type. Her clipped tone from earlier was starting to curve and soften on the edges. Well, I'm by no means an artist. I've just dabbled in painting. Really? That's funny. My dad has too. And he's definitely not an artist. Well, good for your dad. It's a fun hobby. Chris was overdue for an art session and made a mental note to check his semester schedule at the community college. The art teacher who taught the night classes was a bit too quirky for his liking, but he had to admit he learned a lot from the guy. Guess that's one of the many perks of living in a college town. Yeah, Izzy tore a sheet off her notebook. I'll have to have it all set for you for Friday afternoon. It will be ready in time for the vigil. A firework sparked in Chris's head. How do you know it's for the vigil? A wave of color passed over Izzy's face, tinting her pale skin with blotchy patches of pink. I don't know. I guess I just assumed. Well, will I see you there? Not sure, but I know a few of my classmates will be there. Oh, anyone in particular? Well, my best friend, Jessica Rutherford, Taylor Hines, Brooklyn Sotheby, and of course, Sibo. Sibo? You know Sibo? Izzy let out a loud sigh, the loose tendrils dancing on her forehead. Doesn't everybody know Sibo? I mean, he's always got some cause he's pushing. How so? Well, I don't know. He's just passionate. Yeah, you could say that. Have you noticed him pushing anything in particular lately? Chris was grasping for anything at this point. No, but he's always hanging around with an interesting array of characters. I think he's just one of those guys who has an eclectic mix of individual friends, but never really settles into a group. But what do I know? I'm considered a theater nerd. Well, you know what they say about nerds. Izzy raised a perfectly arched eyebrow in question. Chris really didn't know where he was going to go with that line. He was simply trying to sound more down to earth, more charming, and less intimidating with people in general. Advice his sister in law had been giving him since his last girlfriend broke up with him, claiming he was too serious, too attached to his career. I just mean, nerds tend to be ones that are successful in life. So they say. Izzy rested her hands on the edge of her tool belt and waved the paper in between. This will be ready for you on Friday afternoon. You can pay when you pick up. Thanks. No prob. The bells on the door jingled, and Izzy's eyes lit up, moving off Chris and onto the door, then onto the new customer. Hey, Professor Edmonton. Izzy charged toward the front door to greet the man. Top of the morning to you, Izzy. The man made a scene of taking his plaid wool cap off and tipping it in her direction. The lower half of her face was concealed by a thin, fashionable scarf wrapped loosely around his neck. Familiarity erected a red flag in Chris's mind as he walked backwards, slipping into an aisle behind the selection of teddy bears holding hearts, signs, and cards. He peered in between the branches of a leafy green plant, getting a clear shot of Izzy and Professor Edmonton. A professor and a student in one place could be a good opportunity for picking up clues concealed in conversation. He he put on his best acting skills and browsed the cluttered shelves, picking up a bear and analyzing like it was a weapon. Are you still coming to Thanksgiving? Izzy asked. I wouldn't miss your mother's pumpkin pie for anything. I'll be there with bells on. Looks like it might just be you this year. Dad hasn't been too excited about big crowds lately. He wants to keep things low key, and that is why he needs to get back to my art classes. I'll give him a hard time about it when I see him. It was in that moment that Chris recognized the man. He was the one who taught the painting lessons he dabbled in, the quirky one with black rimmed glasses. Without his glasses and a palette of paints at the ready, he was much harder to identify. Questions were whirling in Chris's mind like a tornado. Why was the professor friends with the Donahue family? Did he know Izzy's father from painting? What made them so close that they spent major holidays together? Did he just come to the store to visit with Izzy, or was he a customer? In most situations, Chris would make himself known to the person he had questions for, but something was telling him to be quiet and just observe. Something was telling him that this guy was too smart and well versed to stumble during police questioning. Thankfully, the store was tiny and he could hide and pick up on traveling conversation at the same time. Izzy and the professor moved to the front of the store, their voices trailing behind them. Your dad asked me to swing by and pick up a bouquet of pink roses. Izzy's eyebrows shot up, showcasing the same question mark she had earlier. Really? Why does he want pink roses? I only do as I'm told, but he knew I was getting my coffee next door and asked me to grab them and drop them off on my way out of town. It's been kind of a Wednesday tradition for us. Professor Edmonton leaned in. Maybe your mom has been deserving of flowers lately. Maybe. Izzy's expressions said otherwise, but she went to work plucking individual pink roses from a nearby vase. Before she laid them out on the roll of paper that had the Twisted Vine logo scattered on it, a vine twisting around a giant letter T and V. You're actually leaving Twisted Straits today? Professor Edmonton chuckled. Contrary to what many believe, yes, I do have a life outside of this town. Let me guess, you're going to the big city of Springfield to do some early Christmas shopping. Actually, I'll do all of my shopping in Twisted Straits, supporting local businesses and all that jazz. He cracked his knuckles and pulled his wallet out of his inner coat pocket. Just a little business meeting with some colleagues, since the school is shut down and all. Oh, fellow faculty members, how exciting. Izzy passed a playful wink in his direction. I'll bet if I weren't friends with your family, you'd treat me like a real professor. He laughed and handed over his credit card as Izzy secured a pale pink bow around the paper at the bottom of the bouquet. You're probably right. Izzy's eyes darted to the credit card, laced in confusion. Aren't these for dad? Yes, silly me. They go on your dad's account. Oh, yes, they are definitely not on the house. Wouldn't want to get my boss mad. Izzy winked and tilted her head in the direction of Claire, who had been very specific about tracking what comes in and what goes out, especially when it came to their father's exchanges. Hope you didn't accidentally pay last time you got flowers for him. Well, if I did, it will be my contribution to my favorite local business. The man let out a boisterous chuckle that echoed through the small store. Izzy handed him the bouquet, and smiled widely. I'll bet you say that about all the local businesses. That's why I'm going broke. Dwyer tipped his hat off again. See you on Thanksgiving, if not sooner, Princess Izzy. Professor walked backwards a few steps and turned to push through the door as one pink petal fell from the bouquet, dancing delicately to the floor. Come again soon, Professor Edmonton. More sarcasm leaked from her lips. It didn't take Chris long to figure out that Claire was the kind and sweet one, and Izzy was the sassy, sarcastic one. So I'm going to stop there. We really didn't get into any of the world where there would be a crossover between the fictional story and the non-fictional finance story. It's probably coming. It's been a while since I've read this book, but I look forward to continuing. Thanks for listening.